Lillian Booth dies, leaving behind an estate worth $220 million. Her last will triggers a chain of events that will expose the darkest hours of her family's past.
This is the man that murdered my daughter. I was naturally very interested in what his future would be.
$9 million could make one manipulative family member's future a lot brighter.
He never had any situation where she wasn't there to step forward and help Bobby.
She thought it was something made up by the prosecutors, something that they manufactured against her Bobby.
He never gave up trying to get out. He wants out of jail.
In the wrong hands, the inheritance could literally open doors for a convicted rapist and murderer.
We will do everything we can to make sure that Mr. Reldon does not get paroled.
November 22, 2007, former Broadway actress Lillian Booth dies in her Alpine, New Jersey mansion at the age of 92. Lillian was the widow of Ferris Booth, an early investor in IBM who predeceased her by more than 50 years. During that half-century, left with the largest portfolio of IBM stock in the world, Lillian saw her fortune grow to $220 million. And she became one of the most beloved philanthropists in New Jersey. Trust and estate specialist M.J. Sully admires the way Lillian Booth managed her fortune.
A lot of people, when they want to gift or they want to donate, they think about, I'll leave them in my will. But she didn't do that. She did it while she was alive. She donated to hospitals. She donated to universities. She donated to churches while she was alive, and she was able to enjoy the fruits of her generosity.
Lillian, who had no children of her own, also enjoyed providing for her siblings and their families, as well as for the man who became her life partner after her husband's death, Misha Dabbich.
Misha Dabbich was a very charismatic man. I know that he was a performer. Perhaps that's what drew them together, because she was an actress. He was a singer, a musician, a comedian. It was a very happy relationship, and he was devoted to her.
But for this man, who spent 51 years by Lillian's side, her will is full of surprises.
Ultimately, you read the will and you learn that she did not leave him as a beneficiary in the will.
Although Misha and Lillian never married, friends and family described them as soulmates, still deeply in love even in the last moments of her life.
He was well-liked, and I think they were surprised.
But even more startling than Misha's exclusion from Lillian's will is who she has included. Lillian, whose siblings have all predeceased her, dictates that her entire estate is to be divided among her 12 nieces and nephews. This means that a trust fund totaling nearly $9 million will go to her nephew, Robert Reldon, a man who is serving a life sentence in prison for a double murder. Son of Lillian's sister Marie, Robert Reldon grows up basking under the umbrella of his aunt's immense wealth and benevolence. Through his research for his book The Charmer, Richard Muti gained insight into Reldon's relationship with his Aunt Lillian.
She had no children of her own, and she lavished attention on not only her own siblings, but also her nieces and nephews. And among her favorites was Robert Reldon, whom she called Bobby. She favored him with gifts, with $1,000 checks at Christmas time.
Robert Reldon grows up to become a handsome, well-educated, upper-class young man. Lillian foots the bill while he travels to Europe, goes on scuba diving expeditions, and takes flying lessons. But despite his privileged circumstances, young Robert soon falls into a life of crime. He is charged and convicted for car theft and burglary, and eventually graduates to more serious crimes, including armed robbery and rape. But as prosecutor Charles Buckley recalls, his Aunt Lillian never turns her back on Reldon, instead supporting him with the best defense money can buy.
She always was there. She always provided for him. He never had any situation where it seemed she wasn't there to step forward and help Bobby.
By his mid-30s, Reldon is a repeat offender who's been in and out of jail for most of his adult life. That is until he is convicted for his most serious crime of all, the murder of 2 young New Jersey women. 35 years later, Reldon is still serving a life sentence for those crimes when he receives news that he would have expected 3 decades earlier: the death of his wealthy aunt, and the $9 million she's left him might at last offer him a way out of jail.
The more money you have, the better quality attorney that you can hire.
If he were released on parole, it would not surprise me in the least if he headed right down here to take revenge.
At the time of his Aunt Lillian's death, Robert Reldon has already served 35 years of his sentence and is up for parole. Arthur Reeve is the father of one of the 2 women who were killed by Reldon in 1975. A few months before the parole hearing, he comes to Trenton State Prison to meet with the chairman of the Parole Commission.
This is the man that I knew murdered my daughter. I was naturally very interested in what his future would be.
Reeve will do whatever he can to keep Reldon behind bars. As the chairman of the parole board listens, he starts to tell a story he has told too many times before. In 1975, Susan Reeve was a recent graduate from university and had just gotten engaged to her high school sweetheart, Danny. On October 14th in Hackensack, New Jersey, she was on her way home from work when she caught the eye of Robert Reldon.
When she did not get home that night, we were very concerned, but we thought, well, perhaps she had a date with Danny in the city or a girlfriend forgot to tell us. I had to go to a meeting at Englewood Hospital, and when I got home at 9 or 9:30 and she still had not arrived, we were very concerned. Called all of her friends, called Danny. Nobody had seen her, so we then reported her as missing to the police.
That year, a series of random, brutal homicides had claimed the lives of many young women in northern New Jersey. Susan's disappearance only adds fuel to the media frenzy.
The media coverage was extensive. The major newspaper in Bergen County was a paper called The Record of Bergen County. It's the 2nd largest circulation paper in New Jersey. And they followed this story very closely. Every day, every lead that came up, they had a story about it, usually front page above the fold.
People became very fearful because there was no certainty as to what was happening.
It was absolute hell, not knowing what happened to your daughter, not coming home, not knowing what had occurred to you. All sorts of thoughts go through your mind.
Less than 2 weeks later, Susan's body is found in a wooded area of Tolman State Park, New York. The conclusions of the autopsy are cruelly unambiguous.
That's devastating to think of. He, of course, raped her, and then he put her pantyhose around her neck and inserted something stiff like a board and squeezed it until her neck was broken and she was dead.
Susan Reeve's body is found less than 24 hours after that of another missing woman, Susan Haynes, who has been killed the exact same horrific way.
A bone in the neck, called the hyoid bone, was fractured in exactly the same way on both women. This fracture is normally caused by manual strangulation. And that combination of a manual strangulation causing the hyoid bone to fracture, plus the ligature strangulation with the pantyhose, was almost as though it was a signature left by the killer.
At least it gave some insight into who the police were dealing with in an attempt to capture the killer. I mean, there's two murders of two young women. The bodies are found within close proximity to each other. At least they gave them direct evidence as to the nature of the person that was probably behind these two murders, and fixing the fact that they in fact were the same person was the one who committed the murders.
It said, in fact, that he had strength in his arms and hands to strangle this way, and certainly to overpower both women. It testified to the strength of the killer. Reldon had a history of using chokeholds on his female victims to gain control of them, to gain physical control of them.
After 2 years of investigation, Robert Reldon is charged not only with the murder of Susan Reeve, but also with that of Susan Haynes, whose body was found within 13 miles of Reeve's. But at the trial, the medical examiner testifies that the victims were not killed where their bodies were found. In fact, police investigators find traces of the victims' bodies in the last place one would expect, in a garage belonging to Lillian Booth.
They brought in dogs who could tell the smell, the aroma of the bodies they were looking for, and they found the dogs were indicative that both bodies, that both people had been there for an unknown period of time. So that's what led the police to the house. It was a house that the aunt owned but was just used for storage. She gave the police absolute permission to look in the premises, so I assume she was thinking that he had nothing to do with it. But she did give the permission to look at the house when the police requested it.
Investigators note that the garage has been regularly used by Lillian's nephew, adding one more entry into a long list of strikes against Reldon. But Lillian refuses to believe that her beloved nephew could have committed such horrible crimes.
Imagine having somebody that you consider to be your son that turned out a rapist and a murderer. It's very hard to believe if you don't want to believe it. I don't think she ever admitted to herself that he was as bad as he was.
After an epic 10-year legal battle, Robert Reldon is convicted on 2 counts of murder and is sentenced to life in prison. But under New Jersey law, life in prison doesn't necessarily mean life in prison. And now that Reldon has reached his 70s, the authorities are preparing for his upcoming parole hearing.
I told them that I was there because I could do nothing for my daughter, but that if they looked at the record, they could see that he wouldn't be harmless at 71. And with his tendencies, he might not be harmless at 81.
After 36 years in prison, can Robert Reldon convince the parole board to let him out so he can quietly live out his days enjoying the millions he's about to inherit? Certainly in the past, Reldon has had great success manipulating people in the system. Before his conviction for murder, Robert Reldon repeatedly convinced the parole board into releasing him.
Mr. Buckley and I have co-authored a book about the Reldon case that we've titled The Charmer, and that title is based on the strange ability of Robert Reldon to charm or to put at ease, to put off guard his potential victims. Not only his potential victims, but potential advocates for him.
According to prosecutor Charles Buckley, Reldon's charming ways may be the exact reason why it took the justice system close to 10 years to convict him. During Reldon's first murder trial, a female juror just couldn't believe the evidence brought up by the state.
The prosecutor did an excellent job But this one woman became enamored with Reldon, and her position was, I am not going to convict this man. She didn't want to consider the evidence, and she just felt this nice-looking young man couldn't possibly have committed these two horrible crimes, and she didn't want to hear anything else.
He was a clean-cut young man dressed impeccably in a suit, and she would not vote for guilty no matter what the evidence was.
The rest of the jury was unanimous for conviction. So she refused to convict, and that ended in a hung jury, and that was the end of that trial.
This was not the first hung jury that Robert Reldon achieved in his criminal career. It was the third hung jury he achieved. It is rare for any criminal defendant to even achieve one hung jury in a long criminal career. This was the third that Reldon had achieved. He had been tried by the state 4 times, and 3 times he convinced at least one juror that he could not be guilty of the crimes charged.
One of Reldon's most valuable advocates in the past was sex therapist William Prendergast from the Adult Diagnostic and Treatment Center at the Department of Corrections of New Jersey. Years before he was charged for the murders of the 2 Susans, Robert Reldon was serving a sentence for rape when he volunteered to participate in the prison's rehabilitation program for sex offenders.
He was counseled by this therapist. The man's name is William Prendergast. And Mr. Prendergast became a strong advocate that Reldon had been rehabilitated.
Reldon studied all the psychiatric principles, was able to answer all of the questions, and a lot of these people that are deviates or who are in prison are not dumb. They know how to study. They have nothing to do but study, and they can handle those situations, and unfortunately he was able to do that.
At one point in one of his parole recommendations, Mr. Prendergast said that Robert Reldon would become the most successful parolee in the history of the Rahway prison system.
Robert Reldon was then widely lauded as a model graduate of the prison's rehabilitation system. He even appeared on national television to declare himself a changed man.
He was taken there by the prison authorities as a model student under this program that they had for rehabilitation of sex offenders. And shortly after he appeared on that program, he was paroled.
Lillian does not give up on her nephew and remains generous toward him.
She actually gave him a Volkswagen convertible when he got out of prison to help him adjust to civilian life.
She was susceptible to his charms too.
But not long after Reldon was paroled in 1975, the bodies of Susan Reeve and Susan Haynes were found. Their murders, the latest offense in Robert Reldon's long life of crime.
It was less than 5 months after he was paroled from rape previously that he killed 2 women. And I'm positive in my own mind that he killed them because he was convicted of the first rape by being identified. He was not going to take the chance on being identified the next time. I mean, this man has been antisocial in everything he has done since high school. Stealing cars, snatching purses. It was just a progression of crimes until he got up to rape and then to murder.
But in 2008, Reldon is finally eligible for parole for his murder conviction. Learning of the news that he would get massive payouts from Lillian's inheritance, Reldon is able to retain one of the best criminal lawyers in New Jersey to represent him. To obtain his parole, Reldon also counts on a clemency letter signed by his aunt, which implores the parole committee to show her nephew mercy. But did Lillian write this letter willingly, or was it only signed out of duress?
He tells this hitman that he wanted Lillian Booth taken out, not just robbed, but killed.
Before Reldon can get his hands on his inheritance, Lillian's will has to be officially probated by the court. But this legal formality gets complicated when Misha Dabich, who's been left out of the will, files a motion arguing that since he shared a common law marriage with Lillian, he should be entitled to a spouse's share of the estate. New Jersey doesn't recognize common law marriage, but Misha's lawyer bases his argumentation on the fact that Misha and Lillian also spent some time together in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania does recognize common law marriage, and actually the joke is that if you walk hand in hand in Pennsylvania once you're married.
If Misha's lawyer can convince the court, it will have a major impact on the distribution of the estate.
That would have changed everything. He would have then been the husband, and as the husband, he would have ended up with the lion's share of Lillian's estate.
This would leave less money for every other heir. But in preparation for his action, Misha discloses information that could have even more serious consequences for Robert Reldon's inheritance. Misha claims that Reldon once made him and Lillian sign a clemency letter to the parole board saying that they had forgiven him for his crimes. Misha believes Reldon drafted this letter himself and says he agreed to sign it only because he was afraid of what Reldon might do if he refused.
Reldon was certainly feared by Misha Dabich. There are documents in the pleadings in the litigation case that memorialize that he was indeed frightened of him.
But why would Misha Dabich fear a man who, after all, is serving a life sentence in prison? The answer to this question may be found in an event that occurred in 1977. 2 years after the deaths of Susan Reeve and Susan Haynes, the investigators are closing in on Robert Reldon. Reldon is already serving a 3-year term, this time for breaking and entering, when he is finally charged with the murder of these 2 women.
Reldon wanted to hire one of the most high-powered law firms in the United States, and that takes money.
If you can hire the best attorneys, your chances of avoiding a conviction increase geometrically. You know, money not only buys you the person in the courtroom, it buys you the chance to do all the ancillary things, locating witnesses, hiring professionals to give you expert testimony. Your chances of gaining acquittal are really much higher.
Lillian Booth fronted some of the money for that, but Reldon was fearful that she would pull the rug out from under him and he would be left without sufficient funds to fight these murder charges.
He wanted money. He wanted her money.
On March 23rd, Robert Reldon receives a visitor at Rahway State Prison. This man, whom Reldon has learned about from other inmates, is there at Reldon's request. A request that has to do with his particular line of work.
He tells this hitman that he wanted Lillian Booth taken out, not just robbed, but killed.
Reldon, who strongly suspected he was included in Lillian's will, had decided to cash in his inheritance ahead of time. And he was not interested in splitting the estate with her common-law husband.
It was a double murder plot. Both Lillian Booth and her partner, Misha Dabich, were to be taken out.
Fortunately, the hitman Reldon had hired was in fact an undercover cop. A snitch had tipped off police that Reldon was trying to order a hit from inside. So just before his double murder trial, Reldon was tried for conspiracy to commit murder. Incredibly, Lillian Booth was so convinced her nephew couldn't have plotted to kill her that she testified in his defense. But undercover detective Nicholas Gallo had secretly recorded his conversation with Reldon.
He's caught on tape saying some of the most vile things about Lillian Booth that one could imagine.
They played the tape for her to convince her that your nephew has tried to kill you.
Listening to the tape, Lillian and the jury can hear Reldon instruct Gallo about how to get to Lillian's house, which is located on a heavily wooded street. When you pull in, he tells Gallo, you got them right in the car. They can't even get out, run, nothing. Bang, right through the window of the car. But Lillian has her doubts.
Her loyalty was so strong toward Robert Reldon and her family that she refused to believe it was even his voice on the tape. She thought it was something made up by the prosecutors, something that they manufactured against her Bobby.
But the jury disagrees and finds Reldon guilty of conspiring to kill Lillian Booth and Misha Dabbich. Some 30 years later, Reldon pulls out a letter in which Lillian, just prior to her death, reiterates what she once said in court. "I did not believe at the time my nephew would hurt me, nor do I today." But Lillian's companion, Misha Dabbich, now divulges that he believes this letter was written by Reldon himself.
There was some question as to the circumstances under which this request for clemency letter had been prepared and submitted to the New Jersey Parole Board, and that maybe Lillian did not forgive Robert, and that maybe Lillian did not want to have Robert inherit under the will.
Attorney Joshua Cohn represented one of the parties involved in the estate. When he learns that Misha Dabbich believes Reldon drafted the letter himself, Cohn files a motion to have Reldon equitably disinherited by the court.
There's a law in New Jersey. It's called the Slayer Statute. And it says if somebody actually kills the person from whom they were going to inherit, they are statutorily not allowed to inherit.
Even though Reldon did not succeed in his plan to kill his aunt, Cohn asked the court to consider the Slayer Statute and rule him out of Lillian's will.
I probably would have done some more investigation with Mr. Dabbich. I would have taken his deposition. I would have asked him if he wrote the letter. And I thought that maybe if that came to light, that might support this equitable disinheritance theory.
But seeing no indication that Lillian wanted to disinherit Reldon after his conspiracy for murder conviction, the court denies Cohn's motion.
If she wanted to disinherit him, she certainly could have done that in the privacy of her attorney's office without anybody knowing. There's attorney-client privilege, and she didn't do that. And as I said, I think that speaks volumes to her affection for him.
Misha Dabbich will never testify in this court about the nature of Lillian's relationship with her nephew in the years prior to her death. Having come to a settlement with Lillian's estate, his attorney withdraws the motion claiming that Misha should inherit a spouse's share from Lillian's assets.
The settlement allowed him the Duck Road Pond property, which was worth about $2 million, and it also created a $5.4 million trust for his benefit for his life. So I think that even though, in my opinion, his case going forward in Pennsylvania may not have been successful, I think that it was, he teed up. I think it was a good way to handle it, because he teed up this settlement.
With no further obstacles between him and his inheritance, can Robert Reldon buy his way out of jail? The parents of his last victim are adamant not to let that happen.
We did not carry on this lawsuit to get money. That was the last thing we wanted. We wanted to keep him in prison.
But before long, Reldon takes the law into his own hands, ensuring his own release.
The officer falls to the ground. Reldon jumps out of a third-story window in the courthouse and runs off.
It would not surprise me in the least if he headed right down here to take revenge.
Arthur Reeve is the father of one of the women murdered by Reldon in 1975, Susan Reeve. In 2008, he is on his way back from a meeting with the chairman of Reldon's parole committee when an old friend informs him of Reldon's newfound wealth.
He informed me that Reldon had inherited the income from $9 million.
Reeve immediately contacts attorney Robert Zeller.
He told me that he was very concerned that Mr. Reldon could use this inheritance to hire legal counsel in an effort to try to get paroled.
Indeed. Zeller soon learns that Reldon is now represented by one of the preeminent criminal attorneys in the state of New Jersey.
The more money you have, the better quality attorney that you can hire. It's unfortunate, but that's the truth.
That's when we decided we had to do something.
Zeller persuades the court to halt distribution of Lillian's estate, while Reeve files a lawsuit for pain and suffering against Reldon on behalf of his daughter's estate.
This whole battle that my wife and I have had through Bob Zeller against him has been motivated by keeping him in prison for the rest of his life. We did not carry on this lawsuit to get money. That was the last thing we wanted.
His family feared Mr. Reldon, continues to fear Mr. Reldon, and they just do not want him to ever be paroled, to be loose on the street.
Why would I fear him? Because I think he must hate my guts. I've done everything I can in 36 years to keep him in prison. If he were released on parole, it would not surprise me in the least if he headed right down here to take revenge.
But why would Reeve believe Reldon, who is approaching his 70s and still behind bars, poses a threat to his family? Perhaps because Robert Reldon proved in the past to be quite ingenious at escaping custody. During his trial for murder, Reldon was involved in one of the most sensational scenes to ever unfold at the Bergen County Courthouse in Hackensack, New Jersey. Charles Buckley is the prosecutor who finally got Reldon convicted on 2 counts of murder after an epic legal battle that lasted 10 years. In 1979, he was not yet involved in the case, but he was already closely following Reldon's startling trial. And so was Nicholas Gallo, the detective who had brought about Reldon's conviction for conspiring to have his aunt killed.
We went up and started looking down at the trial. And there's a break in the trial. And Reldon is in the courtroom with a woman very close to him, and they're talking back and forth. And there's one sheriff's officer who was watching the two of them converse. And Nick Gallo says, these people have absolutely no idea who they're dealing with. This guy's dangerous. This is a chance that this guy will try and pull something.
One morning, towards the end of the trial, Detective Gallo's prediction proves to be true.
The normal morning routine is to allow prisoners who are scheduled for court to get dressed up and cleaned up and put on a suit. And they're brought over in shackles to the waiting area where their court appearance is going to occur. The shackles are removed. You don't bring a prisoner out in front of the jury shackled up.
Just before the court convenes, Reldon is getting ready in a small room adjacent to the courtroom when he suddenly attacks the only guard attending him.
We heard a commotion in that anteroom.
He comes out and he sprays tear gas into the face of this sheriff's officer who was supposed to be guarding him. Of course, it incapacitates the officer.
Reldon, who has somehow managed to smuggle mace into court, then makes a desperate move.
Reldon jumps out of a third-story window in the courthouse and runs off.
In a matter of seconds, Reldon reaches the courthouse parking lot and casually approaches an unsuspecting attorney who is about to leave in his car.
One of the witnesses said, I thought he was an attorney or one of our clients. He raised no suspicion in me. That's the charming effect, the normal effect that he had on people.
But Reldon, who is still carrying his tear gas canister, overpowers the man and seizes possession of his car. Before anybody can react, Reldon has fled the scene, racing down the highway heading north. Ironically toward Rockland County, where Susan Reeves' body had been found years earlier.
He paused along the way to rob a woman in a shopping center because he realized he needed money for gas and food if he was going to make good his escape. But that alerted police to the direction that he had gone in, and the police set up roadblocks farther north, and he was seen, and a high-speed chase ensued.
In a memoir he wrote about his most interesting cases, medical examiner Frederick Zugaby reveals information that may offer a clue about where Reldon was headed and why. Later in the day of Reldon's escape, Zugaby, who lives in Rockland County, receives an urgent phone call from the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office. Zugaby is told that earlier that morning, Reldon announced that he had some unfinished business to take care of in Rockland County. Since Zugaby's testimony has weighed heavily against Reldon during the trial, the prosecutor suspects that Zugaby himself may be the business Reldon was talking about. But Reldon will never reach Rockland.
He crashed his vehicle, the vehicle that he had stolen, in a ditch. Police cars pulled up behind him, and he was captured from the vehicle, still holding the tear gas canister in his right hand. He had gained his freedom for barely an hour.
This man was a dangerous psychopath. He had been in trouble with the law from the time he was in high school. He had spent most of his life in prison. He had conspired to have his aunt, who loved him, murdered. This is a very, very dangerous person. You can only imagine what might have happened if he had managed to escape successfully.
This was Reldon's first attempted escape, but it wasn't his last.
He never gave up trying to get out.
After being convicted for murder, Reldon was returned to prison, where one weekend he feigned a serious injury.
He convinced them to take him to a hospital in Trenton. And of course, the police realized how dangerous he was, so they sent 2 prison officials to the emergency room ahead of him. One of the prison guards that was there happened to be a person that was in charge of him during the trials, and recognized a woman in the waiting room who had a neckerchief over her head.
The woman is Sherry Ann Stevens, the same woman from the audience that Reldon got a chance to talk to during his trial. Stevens had since begun visiting Reldon in jail and had fallen in love with him. The woman, who had no previous criminal record, had now been lured into doing Reldon's dirty work for him.
They found out that she was carrying a sawed-off shotgun and about, I think, 40 rounds of ammunition. So it doesn't take much imagination to figure out what he might have done with that.
Given Reldon's past manipulations and escape efforts, Arthur Reeve is now determined to limit the assets at his disposal. By suing his daughter's murderer for pain and suffering, he hopes he can prevent Reldon from ever getting his hands on the millions he stands to inherit. But his attorney, Robert Zeller, soon encounters a major obstacle.
We researched the law, and we were disappointed to find out that we had a very serious statute of limitation problem.
According to New Jersey law, Susan Reeves' parents had only 2 years after the death of their daughter to file a civil lawsuit against Reldon. 3 decades after the murder, that window of opportunity has long since closed. The news is devastating. Because it has been 30 years since Reldon went to jail for Susan's murder, her parents' action is legally inadmissible in court. But for Reeves' attorney Bob Zeller, this lawsuit has become personal.
As a father, I couldn't think of this type of crime having been suffered by any of my children. And I found it just very difficult to believe that someone who had had a child taken in this manner could continue even a semblance of normality for the rest of that person's life. And Art did, and he kept his family together. He kept his marriage together. He and Barbara are, after 60 years of marriage, are just still in love like they were the day that they met, even after going through this horrific tragedy. So I felt as if I could not let Reldon get away with anything. We had to keep him from getting his money, and we had to do everything possible to keep him in prison and keep him from being paroled.
Together, Bob Zeller and Arthur Reeve decide to work hand in hand to get the law amended.
I've never been involved in changing a law before, and I would say most attorneys never have the chance to do that in their career.
Reeve and Zeller hire a lobbyist firm, contact local newspapers, and approach various legislators about their case.
Fortunately, a Senator, Gerald Cardinale, had lived in the same town with Susan and our family. As a matter of fact, he was president of the Board of Education when Susie graduated from grammar school and had handed her diploma. So when I got in touch with him, he agreed to do whatever was possible in the legislature to correct the error.
Meanwhile, Bob Zeller has to convince the probate court to further extend the suspension of Reldon's inheritance.
Mr. Reldon and his attorney fought as strenuously as they could, and we advocated our clients' positions on not a daily, but a weekly or monthly basis. We were in front of the court a lot. It was vigorously defended.
I couldn't have had a finer lawyer. He's developed into a friend. He put not only an immense amount of legal skill into this case, he also devoted his personal life to it.
In May 2009, after hundreds of phone calls, document submissions, and meetings with politicians, it's the moment of truth for Reeve and Zeller. Senator Gerald Cardinale and Assemblyman David Russo introduce a bill proposing an exception to the statute on survivor suits in cases involving homicide. If it is rejected, Robert Reldon will have $9 million to dedicate to his efforts to free himself. But if it passes, Susan Reeve's estate will be able to sue Robert Reldon for every penny he inherited.
The vote passed the Senate unanimously, and the Assembly passed it unanimously.
With the agreement of both chambers, the law is amended.
Changing the law made all the difference in our case.
There was no lawsuit if they weren't able to get around the statute of limitation thing. So once that was removed, he had a wonderful case.
We immediately filed an application for with the court for what's called summary judgment as to liability. That's a determination that the party you are suing, in fact, as a matter of law, owes you some money. And then the case continues thereafter for a determination of what damages are you entitled to. And once we got that, we served on Mr. Reldon information from our experts. And at the same time, Mr. Reldon served on us an offer of judgment saying that he would give us $1 million to end the case, and we rejected that. We then took Mr. Reldon's deposition at Trenton State Prison and put him in a position where anything he would testify to at trial would have been found by the jury to be incredible and not believable. If you had seen his body language when he was speaking to his attorney after completion of his deposition, I think you also would have no doubt that this man has a bad heart, a bad soul, and he's vicious. He was a very smart man, and when I saw the change in his personality and his demeanor from what it was during his deposition to what it was when he was talking business with his attorney, so to speak, in my opinion, he's a chameleon. He can change his personality to suit whatever the circumstances are to allow him to accomplish whatever he wants. And as soon as we were done with his deposition, Mr. Reldon's attorney and I, outside of Trenton State Prison, spoke for about an hour to talk about a resolution of the case.
Realizing he has no further grounds to counter the Reeves' action, Robert Reldon agrees to pay the Susan Reeve estate a trust fund totaling $9 million, the exact amount Reldon inherited from his aunt.
Arthur Reeves' attorney, Bob Zeller, did a masterful job. I mean, what he accomplished was tremendous.
Satisfied at last that they have achieved justice for their daughter, the Reeves now devote themselves to honoring her memory.
We want to perpetuate our daughter's life. She has no tombstone. When we got this judgment against Reldon, we sat down, Barbara and I, and figured, well, the best thing to do will be to contribute to the scholarship fund we had set up in her memory.
In an act of charity that Lillian Booth herself might have applauded, the Reeves donate the entire sum awarded to them to Susan's alma mater, Hollins University in Virginia. At his parole hearing, Robert Reldon fails to impress the committee. The parole board denies his application.
The parole board cited his dangerous tendencies and his ongoing attempts to minimize his responsibility for the deaths of Susan Haynes and Susan Reeve.
I was proud of what the parole board did this time. Had they done it the previous time, my daughter would still be alive.
Art's main concern, as it pertains to Reldon, is to make sure that Reldon never gets paroled. Art, his family, I believe that if Reldon were to be put out on the street, that chances are there would be more victims who would suffer the way that Susie Reeve and Susan Haynes suffered. And I undertook, and my firm undertook with Art, that as long as we're practicing law and we're around, we will do everything we can to make sure that Mr. Reldon does not get paroled.
I think on the loose, he would be a threat to any woman he encountered.
We wanted to keep him in prison, and the sooner he dies, the better. He's contributed nothing to society since the day of his birth. I hope the more I can keep the drum beating, the more people will realize what these people are like, not only Reldon, but all of his ilk. And as the public becomes more conscious of it, maybe they'll be more likely to keep these people in jail or even reinstitute the death procedure so that you get rid of them.
Why Lillian Booth chose to leave a fortune to a man who tried to have her killed, whether or not she forgave her nephew or was simply naive, we will never know. Lillian Booth took these answers with her to her grave.
Perhaps it was still a misguided loyalty to family. Perhaps she still believed him to be innocent. Or there may be the fact that if she wrote him out of her will and she was still alive and he gained freedom on parole, she might be at risk.
Robert Reldon continues to serve out his life sentence in Trenton State Prison, writing dark poetry about the miseries of life on the inside. At age 71, he has now been in prison for half his life. It remains to be seen whether the parole board will ever decide that Reldon has served his time or is no longer a threat to society. But it is quite possible that he will never step outside Trenton State Prison again.